You might think of older evangelism as asking the question, where will you go when you die? But maybe we need to shift to a different question, like, what do you do with your sorrows as you live? This is the Attaching to God podcast. I am Jeff Holzclaw, and we're seeking a neuroscience-informed spiritual formation. As always, we are produced by Embodied Faith. Today we have with us again and Dr. Andrew Root, who is the Carrie Olson, is it Baalson?
You got it.
Did I say that the Carrie Olson Baalson Professor of Family or Youth and Family Ministries at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He writes and researches in a broad, all sorts of different areas, which is amazing. And most recently, he just wrote the book Evangelism in an Age of Despair. And I just want to talk a little bit about that age of despair and what we do with sorrows. You kind of make, first of all, thank you for being on again. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
I know you've had a lot of interviews, about, well, should we still evangelize? What does that really look like? I'm all for evangelism. But you kind of get at this, well, let's just start with the title. And I know maybe you didn't come up with that title, but Evangelism in an Age of Despair. And then the subtitle is Hope Beyond the Failed Promises of Happiness. Can you just talk about that, maybe that subtitle, The Failed Promises of Happiness, and we can kind of get into these other topics?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is a pretty clickbaity title, I think, and I didn't come up with it, so I have to give Jeremy Wells credit at Baker for titling the book. But I mean, these are themes that are there in the book, so I'm responsible for it regardless if I didn't have the creative genius to put it all together. But yeah, I mean, obviously evangelism is the first word in this title before we even get to the subtitle. And in some ways, this is most definitely a book about evangelism. I'd be definitely lying if I said it wasn't. But another way, I think the ground that I'm trying to break in this book is really more a theology of consolation than evangelism. So it's like seeing evangelism as a practice of ministry through a kind of theology of consolation that really makes the assertion that we have been living in, the first 3 decades of the 21st century have been quite sad decades. We're living in sad times, I think. And that sadness sometimes gets manifest in outrage and anger and things like that. But these have not been easy decades, I think. And one of the reasons for that gets to the subtitle is that I think we are just so utterly kind of hell-bent on being happy that it's making us miserable. That we have so doubled down and committed that the point of life is to be happy, that it opens up not only the possibility of sadness, but it does something I think more devious, which it makes us quite afraid of being sad and thinking that sadness is a corrupting force that destroys happiness, as opposed to sadness being an emotion that in many ways comes with happiness, and that sadness itself can have its own beauty within it, and there can be a message inside of it. But we feel like sadness, I think because we see happiness as the gauge that we've made it towards self-fulfillment, then we see sadness as the sign that we haven't gotten our own self-fulfillment, that we haven't achieved self-fulfillment. So we're scared to death of sadness, and yet we're in a time where overwhelmingly, I think people are lonely, anxious, depressed, and sad.
Yeah, we've never sought happiness more than right now. And it seems like we've never had worse mental health than right now, at least in the United States. And so what is that kind of connection? And when you were talking throughout your book, it really kind of gave words to some things that I think many of us have already been feeling. I guess on the one hand, I do kind of approach like a evangelism or whatever you want to call it. I do kind of take the tack at this point of saying like, the gospel is the best thing for your mental health. All sorts of psychological sciences say that religious practice, not just being spiritual, but actually being religious in that old term that sometimes people get mad at, is really good for you. It's a communal life. It's a structured life. Gives you meaning and purpose that are beyond kind of your own individual life. Right. So that's true on the one hand, right? But that's just kind of maybe secular science. It's like, and there's all sorts of actually atheists now who are kind of turning back to religion as kind of a social good that has been lost or something like that. But you're not making that argument for evangelism at all. You're kind of almost going the other direction, which is fine because I don't like these things don't have to be opposed to each other. But I do. I really like that kind of question, and you probably said it somewhere. I just summarized it at the top. Is that like, is evangelism not just like how to be saved, but it's really a different way of handling sorrow, and sadness. And so I kind of, and throughout the book, you kind of make this distinction between a self and a soul. Could you kind of unpack that a little bit about the happiness hunters, as you call them, are trying to fortify the self, but
Yeah.
maybe we, in the church, we need to recover and kind of advocate on behalf of the soul. We're all about saving souls. Let's go,
Yeah.
Andrew.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, really, that piece too, and yeah, I can almost hear people listening to this through the time space continuum being uncomfortable with a duality between self and soul,
Uh,
and I'm not really trying to work a duality here, like the body doesn't matter, but the soul does, or some kind of, I don't know, some kind of popular, um, old kind of views of Christianity or something like that. Um, Though I think we should go older, and if we go older within the tradition, there is a kind of sense of what it means to be both the self as a kind of social construction, I think, and then what it also means to be a soul. And I work that duality. It has a kind of unity, but a duality through Blaise Pascal in this book. So, the very famous philosopher, polymath, the inventor of probability theory and the calculator, Blaise Pascal, maybe one of the greatest minds that Europe has ever created. Pascal's real take was that the creator of the self, I mean, one of the main intellectuals creators of the self was this guy named Michel de Montaigne. And Montaigne's point is you should seek your self-fulfillment, that a fulfilled life no longer is responding to or being in the court with the king or responding to the precepts of the church, that what really makes one live a fulfilled life is to be happy and to be a self who goes to their chateau and lives contently, and can kind of probe their own mind and enjoy gardening when they garden, enjoy sleeping when they're sleeping. There's this kind of nonchalant contentment. And that's what selves are for, to find that kind of fulfillment. And the pushback 200 years after Montaigne by Pascal was that that's not possible. It's just not
mm-hmm.
possible. It's not possible to have this kind of contentment that, I mean, maybe Montaigne achieved it, but that's a very unique reality. But most of us, and I think Pascal thinks all of us we can't achieve this kind of contentment. And we can't achieve this contentment because we're not just selves. We're not just selves who need to be happy. We're also souls. And as souls, there is a sense within us that there's a restlessness that can't be met, that there's a need for something outside of us, to complete us in some way, to save us, we would say in some way, that there's some kind of yearning that we can't manifest or solve within ourself, that our self cannot solve that. And so Pascal thinks that we need to encounter this fire of a God who comes to us from outside of us. But he thinks the only resources we have to do that is not our intellect. It is not reason. I mean, the great master of reason, Pascal, actually thinks you can't reason yourself into this. The only way into it is a kind of surrender through your sorrow. That if you admit that you are discontent, that you cannot make yourself happy, if you'll allow yourself to tumble into your sadness, Pascal's wager is that you're going to find a great presence there, that you're going to find the very ministry God of Israel who encounters Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he is going to come and minister to you and renew you. So the soul is, for Pascal at least, as I work in this argument, the soul is this reality, this need to reach for something transcendent, something outside. That means that a kind of satisfied contentment cannot be accomplished within ourselves. If you just learn how to garden really well and sleep really well and have your sleep number figured out just perfectly, then you're going to be happy and content and you're going to be okay. And yet part of my point is our unhappiness is that people do all this stuff and try to hack all these things and still feel a deep baseline sense of discontentment and are kind of alone on how to make sense out of that reality.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so you're against health and wellness culture. You're against all life hacking. and all optimization schemes. So no wonder you're not rich and famous like all these other people are. No, you're famous. I don't know if you're rich.
I'm neither rich nor famous.
So, but in a sense, I know I was saying that in jest, but that is kind of the drift, right? Like we can't just life hack our way into an optimal living with just the right work-life balance, with just the right kind of dietary kind of configuration to fit our genetic codes. If we just figure that all out, right, we could just, and then we'd be happy and content.
Yeah.
But you're saying, following Pascal and kind of the Christian tradition, right, that there's this deeper restlessness that can't be addressed in the human condition. So I'm rephrasing the old Augustinian kind of question of we are restless until we find our rest in God. But in one sense, are you saying like after the Enlightenment or the Renaissance or wherever you kind of put that time, but in the Enlightenment is we become a people who are restless until we rest in our own self-fulfillment. And so it's us who have to kind of find that salvation in kind of some sort of consumption or kind of a curated life.
Yeah,
Is that what Pascal was rebelling against?
Yeah, that's exactly what Pascal thought it couldn't happen. And yeah, he was reading this kind of recovery of Augustine that was happening at the same time, and found it to be quite true within himself. And the interesting thing is Pascal doesn't necessarily go to proof text that. He goes to gambling. Before he has his conversion experience, he's a major gambler at these Parisian salons. And he realizes that when you gamble, you tell yourself, if you just win this time, you'll be self-fulfilled. You'll be content. If you just win this hand, you'll be able to pay the car off. You'll be able to relax. You'll be able to fly to Hawaii and just really work on meditation. And he had the experience of winning at the gambler's table. And he realized that he goes away assured in his self-fulfillment and contentment. And yet it didn't take but 15 minutes till he starts feeling the agitation of a discontentment within him that always brought him back to the table to gamble and play the ponies again.
So then if we're not trying to just optimize our life or thrill seeking or adventures or collecting memories, what is this turn towards sorrow or sadness? Why does Pascal go that direction? And how is that a consolation for us? Doesn't that just make us feel worse?
Well, I think Pascal's point isn't that we should turn towards it. It's that you don't have a choice. That sorrow is part of the human condition, and needing to say goodbye and grieve is part of the human condition. And so one of the books and conversations that kind of ignited this project within me, there are a few, but one was reading this book called The Wellness Gospel by this New York Times author who had kind of written for the New York Times on wellness culture. And she comes to be quite disgruntled with wellness culture. And the book starts in a very captivating way where she says like she was all in. She was a fully committed wellness culture person, and then her father died. And there was nothing. Like there was nothing inherent within wellness culture that could help her bear this grief, and that she felt utterly alone. Like for all the cleanses and even the meditation apps and all that stuff, which she wasn't actually down on. She thought, yeah, it had value. It had psychological value. It helped. But at the end, when a great sorrow came upon her life, when her father died, she said she found herself, she grew up Jewish. She said she found herself yearning for these ancient these ancient religious practices where someone would come and sit with her and actually be with her. And that was gone. And so I think this is part of my point, is that the goal isn't to glorify sorrow or to say like, let's rebrand sorrow as a good thing. It's the reality of it is that we're headed towards it. Like we have to say goodbye in this human life, that there are great sorrows before us. And yet we live in a cultural moment where we almost have broadly, we don't have anyone to be with us in those moments. And our society is kind of abandoned any kind of structures or any kind of communities that can walk with us in that. And maybe this is a big calling of the church and of the Christian now, is to join people in their sorrow. And my point isn't to use that as an instrument for evangelism, but it becomes evangelistic in simply doing it and simply bearing that sorrow with people.
Well, it seems like, so I'm just thinking right now that like it seems like Pascal's trying to tell the truth about the human condition
Mhm.
in the deepest kind of way. And that the older kind of evangelism, I was raised fundamentalist, so it's like, do you know where you're going to go when you
Yeah.
die? And the truth being proclaimed there as the setup for the gospel, right, is something like, well, your sins, the wages of sin is death, right? But what I think you're suggesting is kind of the same thing. Like, well, we still need to tell the truth, but what are we telling the truth about? We're telling the truth that like life is hard.
Mhm.
There are things that make us sad, and that we should actually admit those and look at them. And then there's kind of a consolation, or I guess the evangelistic moment then comes after that truthful moment of life is sorrowful, and then the gospel is, and the man of sorrows walks with us in the midst of those things. We are, just so everybody knows, we are recording this during Holy Week, although it won't air. But this is like right in the middle of Holy Week, where Jesus comes to Jerusalem and he challenges, but he also teaches, and then ultimately he dies, for our sin
Mhm.
and suffering. So
Mhm.
how does then the man of sorrows become a gospel like in this moment? Like how does that happen?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is where, in one play, in one way, that Pascal doesn't go far enough. So Pascal does think that if we lean into our sorrows, his wager is that we're going to meet a great presence there. Um, but Pascal kind of has this assumption you can do that by yourself. And I don't think that's possible. I think you actually need a community to walk into
Mm.
your sorrows. But I think the call of evangelism is much more. I mean, like you, I had these experiences of evangelism, both, being a high school kid told to do it and in some ways having it done to you, which is like the four spiritual laws. Like, do you propositionally hold these 4 points? And then if you can say, if you can get to the end of end of this and pray the prayer, then you've been evangelized. But I think really within even the Christian tradition, what evangelism is the invitation to become a pilgrim, to walk a path. And that path is a path of sorrows. It is a path of saying goodbye. And so in the medieval period, when a pilgrim would go on pilgrimage, they would give a will and testament because they weren't sure they were ever going to be back. And so it was a deep sense of walking towards God, but also walking into your sorrows of saying goodbye. And I think what the church does in this time is invite people onto a pilgrimage, which is to say, there's something deeper going on within your sorrow. Your story has significance, and we want to walk it with you. And it does really start by the confession of your brokenheartedness and in
Mm.
walking into that, and not because that's any kind of trick to win leverage over and against people. It's because the way this God reveals God's self, particularly in the person of Jesus Christ, is to enter into sorrow and brokenness and suffering. And as you said, to be the man of sorrows who promises to be with him for us in those moments. So at the core, evangelism is really about helping people hear the call of Jesus Christ to follow. And where Jesus Christ is at work, I want to make this claim, really ultimately through Luther's theology of the cross, is that God is present, revealing God's self, beckoning a call to us in our places of loss and brokenness and suffering.
Mm. Well, I just changed my mind. We're gonna release this episode this week, so it lands during Holy Week. So everyone's gonna be like, "No, it's out right now. Why did Jeff say that?"
Right.
Um, well, why don't we talk about the theology of the cross? For
Yeah.
people who don't know, what is the theology of the cross as Luther kind of understood it, and how is it kind of counterposed to a theology of glory? And in your
Yeah.
book, you kind of give the prehistory of all that, which I thought was great. But let's just go with like the kind of typical Lutheran kind of
Yeah.
perspective there.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the typical Lutheran perspective is contested in some ways too, because the question is the theology of the cross is where Luther wants to start. So he wants to say, um, the God we should contemplate, the God that reveals God's self, the God we can know, is found first and foremost in Jesus Christ crucified. I mean, it's very Pauline in that sense, where Paul says, "I choose to know only Christ in Him crucified." So for Luther, the cross, this is the contested part within even the Lutheran world, is The theology of the cross is, of course, in part an atonement theory. I mean, it is talking about how salvation occurs. But first and foremost, I hold that the theology of the cross is what we might call a hermeneutic for who God is and how God acts. And that God
Mm-hmm.
becomes present first and foremost in these moments, not of triumph, not of self-fulfillment, but God becomes present first and foremost in moments of brokenness, in moments of sorrow. That it's in those moments where God becomes near. So Luther says in the Heidelberg Disputation that as only Luther can say in his, his bombastic polemical way. He says that a theologian of glory calls good evil and evil good, and a theologian of the cross calls a thing what it is. And the thing he's referring to is that the human life is filled with sorrow and brokenness and goodbyes, and that what we need out of theology is not some kind of metaphysical machine. What we ultimately need out of theology is a vision of how this God is a minister who cares for the brokenhearted, who comes
Mm-hmm.
near those who are lost. That we need that we need this vision of a God who leaves the 99 for the one. That this is a God who absurdly almost is committed to the outcast and the lonely and the brokenhearted. And so if you want to find this God, you have to find this God where this God chooses to be present. And this God chooses to be present with the brokenhearted. This God chooses to be present with all those who are near a cross or find themselves at the cross in moments of loss. So that's at its heart, I think, what the theology of the
Yeah.
cross is about. To look for God there. Don't look for God somewhere else.
So the call to take up your cross and follow me isn't a call to self abnegation or suffering or doing the hardest possible thing ever, but it's committing yourself to being where God is at all
Mm-hmm.
times and telling the truth about the thing, saying that what was it, calling a thing what it
And what
is.
it is, yeah.
So I think because sometimes so back to evangelism,
Yeah.
or conversion or proselytation, where you're trying to convert someone, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the criticism is, oh, when people have just had a bad turn in life, a loved one has died, they lost their job, they're at their lowest, and then the Christians come and prey on people at their weakest,
Yeah,
you
sure.
know, and they convince them of all this nonsense, and it's this a strong rational people who can resist that, right? But but in one sense, it's almost the reverse. It's actually, well, it's the Christians who come, evangelism at that moment is to come alongside someone and to speak truly and say, well, this is horrible.
Mhm.
This is sad. This is sorrowful. And there's one who's walked this path with you. Right? And that is good news. And so in that sense, it's that weakness and strength, as Paul and others kind of say. So
Yeah.
so if you've ever felt bad, like you were taking advantage of someone at their lowest, well, that's where God is. So, if they find God where God is, that shouldn't be so
Yeah.
surprising.
Yeah, and we actually don't honor people's sorrow and suffering if we're like, oh, there it is. Now is the time where we can leverage that for something. Like I think the theology of the cross makes this claim that God, that the Trinity. I mean, this is the way Jürgen Moltmann has famously worked this theology of the cross, is that sorrow, loss, grief is part of the inner life of God, that God knows those experiences. So the claim is that those who are up against those experiences of death, loss, grief, brokenness, that it's through that reality that they find union with God, that God is with and for them in those moments. And so what we do in evangelism is simply proclaim the truth that God is with and for you. We have no religion that can solve these problems. And we don't think, hey, your life sucks now, but if you take on this religious conception, then you'll be driving a Mercedes in 6 months. Like that kind of prosperity gospel is really antithetical to the theology of the cross. The theology of the cross is a kind of lived theology that says, hey, that Jesus Christ is with and for you. When things seem their darkest, that's where God chooses to be present.
So, like prosperity gospel, would you say it's like a theology of the self then?
Yeah.
Whereas the kind of gospel of sorrows is for the soul. How would you kind of,
Yeah.
because I want to kind of go back to that a
Yeah.
little bit, not,
Yeah.
but how do those two things kind of fit together? Because like we have the old kind of ancient For those who don't know, kind of like there is a theory in which Christianity takes over this quest for happiness, the good life, and that Christian theologians will argue, well, the highest and best happiness is to love God. So they kind of do put it on this track toward happiness, and you even talk about this a little bit about the consolation of what is called the consolations of philosophy, and you kind of juxtapose it to this guy who was a predecessor to Luther and he talks about the consolations of theology. Could you kind of talk about
Yeah, yeah.
that difference? Because there's lots of Christian traditions that are like, yeah, Christianity makes me happy, or it
Yeah.
should make us happy. And I even argued, and I have argued, that there are these good mental health reasons. But
Yeah.
what is this consolations of theology as opposed to
Yeah.
philosophy or psychology and mental health professionals?
Yeah, and I do, and I yeah, and to get into that, I mean, I do want to be really clear. Like, I think that part of the Christian life is joy, and we could call that happiness, But the depth of joy, again, like if we think of happiness as coming from your own self fulfillment, joy is this incredible gift that you didn't have any control of. That is given to you. It is gift, and It's an overwhelming sense of joy, like, for instance, when you get the gift that the treatment that your spouse has been going through for cancer, that the scans have come back clean. Like, there's a sense of overwhelming joy that this is gift. And I do think the Christian life is a deeply one of joy, but it has to have this kind of dialectical nature of the suffering and the joy. They play together. So this is, to your question about a philosophy of consolation. That was a big question all the way back into the kind of patristic era of the church. It's like, if we are, here we are. You said this is going to release right before, Easter. So now, being Easter people, not only do we have Good Friday and those sorrows, but now death has been overcome with resurrection. This is, proleptically, this will happen for all Christians, but, it's happened in the body of Jesus Christ. So a big question for like the early church fathers was, well, could you grieve when someone died? Like, could Christian people actually grieve, or is that a kind of violation of your commitment to the resurrection? And what became a significant kind of piece was kind of thinking about, well, what's the philosophy of consolation, and is it appropriate to grieve, and is it appropriate to cry when someone dies? And they said it is very much the case. But then there was this book written called The Consolation of Philosophy in the 6th century by a guy by the name of Boetius, who was preparing to be killed. He's a Christian. He was preparing to die, and he writes this story where Lady Philosophy comes to him and prepares him to die. And this is one of the most important books of the medieval period. Everyone read it. Everyone thought about the consolation of philosophy. Well, I think what leads up to the theology of the cross is there's this mystic in the 14th century, the chancellor of the University of Paris, named Jean Gerceau, or if you're from Wisconsin, Jean Gerson. And Gerceau,
I like Gene Gerson.
Yeah,
Gene Gerson's good. Yeah.
You
That's
want to
how
have
I
a
read
beer,
it.
right?
In the book, that was the name that I heard.
Right. Well, and if you want to have a beer, you want to have a beer with Jean Gerson. If
Yeah.
you want to confess your sins, you want to confess them to Jean Gerceau. But Gerceau ends up kicked out of France. I mean, there's 2 popes. Talk about being in sad times. It's a hellish period. And he ends up, while he's in exile, he writes this theology of consolation. And so instead of philosophy of consolation, he writes a theology of consolation. And the big move there was to free theology from a kind of scholastic system that was just kind of trying to work these kind of rational philosophical categories. And he was making a claim that theology could actually help us cope with our lives. It could help us recognize the presence of God near us, that theology could be an asset in helping point to a God who comes very near to us. And part of my argument here, that's a little bit inside baseball that probably most readers don't care about, but I do, is that I really do think that Luther's theology of the cross is essentially a theology of consolation. And he's really drawing from Gerceau to think about how theology should function for us, that theology shouldn't just be ideas in a university, that it should be a way that we live and we die. And And it really is Rousseau who says that the Christian life is one of pilgrimage. And I think one of the most important pieces on that that's really quite practical is he says, the Christian life as a whole is a life of pilgrimage. And to be evangelized, you have to be invited into this path of pilgrimage. But when you do that, it has to be done ad diem. And what he means is it has to be done to God, towards God. No one goes on pilgrimage. The difference between, a workout and a pilgrimage is the workout is to work on the self. The pilgrimage, to use our soul language again, is to God and about bearing these losses and these yearnings that are deep within. But the other thing that's really fascinating is that at this time, the 14th century in France, to say ad diem was also an idiom for goodbye. So, leaving this podcast and say ad diem to God, goodbye. And so it is. So what Rousseau is getting at too is that to be a pilgrim is to say goodbye. And the Christian life and why one needs theology is to help us recognize and to help us give us companionship as we have to say goodbye in life. And life is all about a pilgrimage of saying goodbyes. But in these goodbyes, God is present. God is near. That the sorrows of saying goodbye is where God will act and move and bring life. And this is this deep sacramental reality is that like when we find ourselves in the places where God shouldn't be, in sorrow and grief and brokenness, is the places where God chooses to be. And this kind of theology helps us see that, helps us recognize that reality, that what seems like a place God shouldn't be is a place where God is. And where there's a great goodbye, the God of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the God of the foolishness of the cross becomes present.
And that's kind of a way of understanding when Jesus, declares, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." That truth and the life toward God is journeyed on the way of the cross, the way of sorrows and sufferings, and that He is the one that has gone before us already, and that's why we can follow Him, and that's why He's a trustworthy Savior, because this path is not unknown to Him.
Yeah.
So if I were, I should have sent this to you beforehand, but if I were to ask you, what's Andrew's 4 spiritual laws for evangelism in an age of despair? How could we write up this little chick track or whatever that used to be called?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a great question. I may have to think about this more, but at one level, I want to say that the whole book is in many ways an anti-track. Like it's making a case for an anti-track in the sense that, like Charles Taylor appears in this book as he's appeared in a lot of my books. Not quite as front and center as some of the other ones. But one of the things that Taylor says, I don't quite deal with in this book, but I think is informative in this moment is what can happen to Christianity in our time is it can become excarnate. So as opposed to incarnate, it can become excarnate. So instead of being embodied, and even thinking of soul as an embodied reality, it can become excarnate. And what he really means by that is it can become ossified into propositions that asks you to commit to and dwell in, as opposed to an incarnate embodied reality that invites you on pilgrimage to search for meaning in the midst of all of your deep lived experiences. So part of the whole problem with the track is that it runs the danger always of being excarnate. And for those of us who even had tracks like the 4 spiritual laws that did something in our lives, and God used them because there's another person standing there who actually manifests the gospel deeper than the track itself. Like, I'm sure there's a few people listening right now who just found a track on the side of the road maybe, and that, they read it and their eyes were open. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but even that experience, I think if you interrogate it a bit, there are other embodied persons who have proclaimed this, like maybe the track reminds people or takes people back to the fact that their grandmother's been praying for them for decades or something like that, So the Christian story, from my perspective, especially as it's passed on to others, is always embodied. It's always lived. So if there was this 4 spiritual laws, really, or I don't even know if laws would be the right phrase, but maybe there's like 4 pilgrim steps. I mean, it really is just a deep sense of what it means to say goodbye. and what it means to proclaim that in our saying goodbyes, that God is present in the midst of that. And that we need others, we need a community to do that with, and that there is some kind of meaning, there is some kind of deep encounter in the midst of our moments of sorrow. That the church, whether people come to become members of our churches or become committed people, the ministry of the church is to console our neighbors regardless. That's the call of the church, is to simply be where Jesus Christ is present, and Jesus Christ is present ministering life to those who are at experiences of death. And so it's never instrumentalized. Like, if we do this, we'll end up with 25% growth in all of our denominational churches. Right. That would violate the whole thing. That simply the church is called to go where Jesus Christ is, and Jesus Christ is found at places of death, bringing life out of it. And that, I think that's how we testify to the good news, to the angelic news that that death is overcome with life.
I love that. So it's not just that, like, we're minds that need to be convinced of a proposition about salvation, but we're not also just a self or seeking happiness, right? But there's like the deeper soul, as you kind of been bringing us back to, and speaking the truth of the soul. Any last thoughts about this evangelism that you're of sorrow? Any way to bring us down? Even no, I'm just kidding. Not. But any last thoughts before we sign off for our Holy Week?
Yeah, I mean, it really is living. I think it's great that this is going to come out right now in Holy Week, because I think it is living this very dialectic. This kind of two-sided reality of death and life, that we see this very week, that the sorrow of the cross cannot be, you can't cut the corners off of it. You can't shine it up. It is utter horror. It is death. There's no way to see it any other way. And yet it is darkness and utter darkness. And yet the resurrection is life. It is light. And so these two dynamics, that going through the cross is how we find life, and that God is a God of life, who therefore decides to minister life to those up against death, to me is the utter good news of the gospel. The reason to keep on this path searching.
Well, I'm a part of a group who really tries to enter into the joy, thankfulness, and gratitude is kind of a lot of the neuroscience practices. And that's all well and good, but I just want to encourage everyone, during this Holy Week, but also throughout their lives, that embracing that sorrow that they have, being able to walk with someone else who's in that place is good, and that we can't let our religious practices be a defense against that sorrow, but actually they should be opening us up to them more, so that we can weep with those who weep and then rejoice with those who rejoice. Well, thank you so much for being on again, and thank you for all the hard work you put into thinking about these things and putting out a book. I know we really appreciate it. I've already bought like 2 other books, looking at all your footnotes, and I probably have more in my Amazon cart that I'm like, should I get that? No, I shouldn't get it. Well, but maybe I should. Is my birthday coming soon? Right. You know how it is. You're surrounded by books too, for all of us who are watching online. But thank you so much, and hopefully we'll do this again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.